So then, tell me about what life was like growing up, going back to your childhood.
I was born, yeah, that's for sure, right? Anyway,
Yeah, you were born
in Berkeley, California, in January 1st, 1936, 86 years ago. And my mother and dad lived in Concord, California, but back then it was a small community, no doctor's hospital to speak of. So, I don't know, 50, 60 miles or whatever over to Berkeley. And so they had to go to the hospital over there. It was Alta Bates Hospital in Berkeley, California. And my dad was Charles, my mother was Ethel, and I guess I'll go back a ways. My mother and dad were from Chicago, Illinois. My dad's dad was a medical doctor, but he dropped out of being a doctor after several years. He was a children's doctor, and he graduated from Western Reserve University in Cleveland, and he was a children's doctor. But then he was into music. He loved music. He was a rich baritone, and he sang all over the place. And so anyway, my dad he wanted to be a musician. His whole life was built around he wanted to be a musician. He wanted to write music. He wanted to sing, and he wanted to whole life. And at that time, this new innovation of radio had just come into effect not too many years before. And he thought, well, maybe he could get into radio and the music and make a living that way. So I think he was selling life insurance when they got married. I'm not sure, something like that. And my mother was working for Montgomery Ward in Chicago as a bookkeeper. And my dad had a choral group that was called Metropolitan Singers in Chicago. And he even had some write-ups, and Music News of Chicago said, Tudor Williams, my dad's middle name, young Tudor Williams, is fast becoming one of Chicago's leading choral conductors. And I got a write-up on that here somewhere. And so anyway, he had this choral group. Anyway, my mother liked music, and she got acquainted with the group, and she came, and she was one of their soprano singers in the choral group. Well, anyway, my dad was always a real super caring, loving, sentimental kind of person, and she liked that. And they got together and got married. And they just got married, and the wedding day they got into a Packard that my mom had bought and drove to California.
I never knew that. How old were they?
My dad was married on his 30th birthday. Wow. He had been married before briefly, to not a good marriage. My mother had never been married. She was 35. Yeah. And she didn't drive a car and didn't have a driver's license, but she bought this 28, 29 Packard Roadster. She bought that, and then they drove in that Packard to California. Several days getting there, and they went to Concord, California, where my Uncle Ira, my mother's brother, lived with his family, and he had like 10 acres of ground there somewhere. So they had this shack on the back of the property, which my mother and dad lived in for a while. And then they bought their own place in Concord, 2-bedroom, whatever, house, and they lived in that for a while. And that's where Ray and I were both born, not in that house, but in Alta Bates Hospital. And then I think probably about the time I was about 3 years old, they came to Niles, California. Niles was a town on Alameda Creek, which is now part of Fremont, California. Niles is, but there's still a road called Niles Canyon Road, still there. It goes on up the canyon beyond their house, up through the mountains, and they went there and they started a small restaurant called the Maples, Well, the maples, because there was, I think there was 3 great big maple trees out there on the property. So I think they rented the property, but they had this nice store there, a nice little restaurant there, with a gas station and garage, and well, maybe it was just a small restaurant, but it had hamburgers and coffee and all that kind of stuff. And also, this was just the end of Prohibition, right? Just ended, and so they were able to sell beer and wine there. And so on Saturday night, sometimes they would have a little dance floor out back where some people came and danced. Now, to give you a little perspective here, the Niles Canyon Road they lived on, there were 2 bridges to get to where they were that led out of the town of Niles, led up the river a ways, and then there's another bridge across the river, Alameda Creek again. You had to head up the canyon. So, which means there's 2 bridges in there in between, along the river. But anyway, the county or the state or something came along later on to say, well, this is stupid. Why do we have 2 bridges? Why don't we just put the road on the other side of the river and the other side of the creek and not get out this nonsense? So they did. So the end of that was that my folks' restaurant was on a dead-end road. No cars coming through. Before that, it was trucks. They all stopped there to eat because it was a nice place. Also, there was down at the end of the road where we lived, the end of Niles Canyon Road, there was a pottery where they made pottery things. And so the trucks that came back and forth into the pottery, they always stopped there to have coffee and whatever and chat with my mother. And mostly my mother, yeah. Mostly my mother, yeah. And then there was, for a long time, there was a group called the Tunnel Gang, and that was people working on the railroad on the tunnel. Several years they worked on it, and they all came there too for meals and stuff like that. So we had the Tunnel Gang, the Pottery Gang, and the truckers that came through. So they did pretty good, and I had a wonderful remembrance of Niles, California, of that place there. The garage, there wasn't a whole lot there, but there was a pit out in the garage where you could climb down into the pit and the car would drive over it and you could give lubrication and stuff like that. Anyway, and then there was one gas pump. So I don't want to go into a lot of stories about the gas pump, but I'll give you one, and that is the one gas pump there, regular gas only, was 18 cents a gallon back then. I know that because I saw it in the picture. And anyway, I was a little kid that was always getting into things, so I went out by the pump there, and there was a big hole in the ground there, and I put the water hose and stuck it in there, and turned it on, and let it run for a long time. Well, it ran water into the gas tank.
Oh my gosh!
And so some guy was. There's several people. The one guy that came, he got in his car, he filled up his car, and he drove away, and his car conked out. And he had somebody check on this, and there was water in it. So they had to pump the whole tank full of gasoline, pump it out, and I got talked to. I think about.
Okay, I was going to say, did you confess?
Huh?
Did you confess to it?
I didn't have to. They knew what it was. They knew which one of the kids did these kinds of things. So that was one little thing. The other thing really I'll never forget, and that is my dog Spot. And this is a story that's told to me more than once, and that is we had a dog Spot. He was mostly German Shepherd, mostly. But people said that when my brother and I would walk out toward the street, he would come out there and grab us by the seat of the pants with his teeth and pull us back from the road. And my cousin Bob Reedy told me that. He said he watched it happen. He wouldn't let us go out in the highway. So anyway, Spot was our guardian. And anyway, one day we looked all over for the dog, looked over and over, and finally we walked up on the railroad tracks and we found our dog with head on one side and a dog body on the other. Boy, that was traumatic. Well, that was really traumatic. Our dog Spot.
How old were you when you lived in Niles?
I think I was 3, 4.
You remember back that far?
Oh, then clearly.
And then when did you move from Niles?
When I think I may have just turned 5, but I may have not even been 5, but I just turned 5, and then we moved from there to Coloma, California, up near Placerville, Coloma, California, where you gold discovery in Coloma, we moved up there to our rented house, owned by an old lady named Nancy Vernon, and we lived in that house just a few months, but just long enough. I remember my dad planted a little garden with radishes and stuff like that, but we just there for a few months. And meantime, Ray went to school there as a first grade for a short period of time, and then when we moved, he had to go start somewhere else. So we went to this. We always referred to it as the ranch. It was out in a place called Fruit Ridge out, and it's now called Apple Hill, but back then it was called Fruit Ridge, out northeast of Placerville, about 6 miles. And moved out there, and we had 80 acres of ground, and on this old house that probably been built 100 years before, but an old house, no electricity, no plumbing, and we had a cold water pipe that ran from a spring up on the hill down to the house, cold water pipe, but there was no plumbing, no water in the house other than that.